So who recognizes this?
Eliza.
Yeah. Right. So what Eliza does looks something like conversation. How does Eliza actually function inside? What are its rules? Well, one of the pieces of audience input we just saw was you don't argue with me. And what Eliza does is start out by making substitutions. You becomes I, me becomes you. The next thing Eliza does is choose a keyword in the post-substitution version that is the most important. In this case, you is the most important keyword. Keywords have decompositions associated with them. One of the associated decompositions for you is anything I, anything you. And since blank matches anything, that matches the above, right? So nothing I, don't argue with you. Then decompositions have different reassemblies associated with them. One of them is, why do you think I 3 you? And 3 is for the third position in the decomposition. And that gives us, why do you think I don't argue with you? Right? So this is how Eliza functions. And I would say, as an operational logic, that's conversation as transformation, right? That's the function of Eliza. And this can actually be quite successful for people when they first encounter it. And so we actually have a term that grows out of this initial success, the Eliza effect. The idea that a computer system can appear much more capable, much more intelligent when you initially encounter it than it actually is on the inside. And that has led to various responses, right? Probably the most famous response is Joseph Weizenbaum's, right? This is not a picture of Weizenbaum, right? This is meant to represent a sort of moment that he talks about in his book, right? So the first thing he did was write an article unmasking Eliza, saying this isn't really magical. And the next thing he did was publish in 1976 a book that basically marked his ceasing to be an AI researcher and instead being a critic of AI, saying we really do ourselves a disservice when we think that any computational machine could match what we have as humanity. And this story is, remember, this wasn't on a screen, this was on a teletype. This is the story of Weizenbaum being asked to leave the room by his secretary so that she could have a private conversation with the therapist, Eliza, right? So for him, his response is that the Eliza effect is disturbingly powerful, and that this is actually something we need to worry about. Writing about 10 years later, Lucy Suchman had a different response, right? So in her book, Plans and Situated Actions, she relates Eliza to like the ethnomethodological work of people like Howard Garfinkel. So you might know Garfinkel's new kind of therapy experiment, where he had students write about their personal problems with yes or no questions at the end and slip them under a door to another student who, as a therapist, would give answers, and they would slide paper back and forth, and then he would interview the students at the end about their experience of this new kind of therapy. And they would have these narratives where they would say, well, at first my therapist thought that really, this was my problem, but over time my therapist realized that I should really focus on this other thing, and this was really, where my problem lay. And this is what the student therapist was doing, just flipping a coin. Yes or no. They didn't read the questions. They just heads or tails, yes or no. So for Suchman, this reveals how much of the work of communication is being done by Eliza's audience, right? We think it's a conversation because we bring so much expectation to every piece of human communication that we can even interpret near nonsense as a conversation, right? Now, another 10 years later, Janet Murray had a rather different response, right? And her response is that Weizenbaum is perhaps the premier literary artist in digital media. And at least as I read that chapter, she doesn't just mean first, she means best, right? And best because he had such a powerful combination of rules and text in the script, that the two went together so well. It was sort of a good model for what digital media ought to be. Which sort of brings me to the question, with my practitioner hat on, should we build ELIZA-style systems, right? If they're powerful enough to be frightening, if they harness all this expectation, if they're a great literary success. But when I find myself with that question, I start thinking about my first experience with ELIZA, right? I think I'm just going to keep returning to high school the longer this talk goes on, right? So in the 1980s, I first experienced ELIZA on an online BBS, and I would tend to say things to ELIZA like, "You are going to repeat what I say in the form of a question," and ELIZA would say, "What makes you think I am going to repeat what you say in the form of a question," right? And so I would argue that actually the power of initial expectation is great. But ELIZA-style illusions break down, and they do it in a manner that reflects the underlying system shape, unless interaction is severely restricted. Right? And what do I mean by severely restricted? I mean things like the coin flip. Imagine if Garfinkel's experiment had been done with a magic 8-ball. Just having that many more responses would have made the illusion break down quite rapidly. Right? Now, I don't think breakdown is so bad. Breakdown can actually be an interesting aesthetic. But unfortunately, with ELIZA, the underlying system that's revealed through breakdown is kind of boring, right? Conversation as transformation doesn't take you very far. It gets used up. Now, not to say it can't be used interestingly at all. Like Adrienne Wurtzel has used it as a foil for human actors, right, in her robot performances that are driven by the ELIZA script. But I don't think by itself it's getting at what I'm interested in talking about, which is a kind of alternative. Right? So rather than processes for tricking the audience, making them think there's something more going on than is actually going on, we can craft processes that express ideas that are in the work. Obviously, this is not a new idea. On some level, there's a whole history, again, through my own tradition of writing, but in other traditions as well, of crafting processes that are an important part of the expression of the ideas in the work. But for most of this tradition, these processes are used to shape the work of the writer, right? Like the constraints on the Oulipo, or the performance, right? So like what the constraints or what the processes cause the players to do in a cage piece, rather than shape the experience of the audience, rather than shape, say, the kind of experience we have with ELIZA, where what the processes that express ideas do is have a back and forth with us as playful audience members, right? So if I don't think faking it is the answer, if I actually think we should create processes that express ideas, am I just saying, well, let's do something that's never been done? No, actually, there's a long history of this as well, right? So here's one alternative to faking it, right? So probably a number of you have heard of James Meehan's Tailspin, right? It's been written about by Janet Murray, Espen Orset, Jay Bolter, and so on and so on. It's been written about in part because it's the first major story generator. And by story generator, I basically mean flexible model of fiction. If you take something like a choose-your-own-adventure book and you rip out a page, all that happens is you can't read that page. And maybe if that page was the only way that you could get to another page in the future, the route to that other future page is cut off. But the rest of the book remains as it is. Whereas because story generators are created out of rules, if you do something like change the rule for how characters move through the world, or change the rule for how characters bargain with each other, you can change many, many, many stories as a result of this one rule change. So the processes of Tailspin express ideas. In particular, they express the ideas of what we now call the sort of scruffy group of artificial intelligence and cognitive science researchers at Yale at a time in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. And it's harnessing those concepts, those ideas about how humans think, for story generation. So Meehan writes, Tailspin includes a simulator of the real world. Turn it on and watch all the people. The purpose of the simulator is to model rational behavior. The people are supposed to act like real people. So the brief way of saying that is that processes don't just express things to audiences. They express relationships with schools of thought and communities of practice. In this case, the particular processes I'm going to talk about relate to this community and its practices.